Okay, so I kind of need to stand here. Okay, because I usually walk around a little, but I'll try to stand still. Okay, yeah, but the kind of methods and also methodology when I do discourse analysis is my approach is that it's kind of a non-standard methods that we use. It's not like there are specific, like in statistics, where there are particular ways of doing different sort of statistical modelings and so on. For discourse analysis and for many other more qualitative kind of research, we also need to use our imagination a little bit when we put together a strategy for researching a particular question. It does not follow that we can do anything we want, that everything is equally good. The kind of criteria that I have myself when I do research is, I like it, my research strategies, my plan for doing research to be systematic, empirically sensitive, so they capture, reality out there, and transparent, transparent so you actually say, make it clear to everybody reading this what you're doing, and then of course arguing why you're doing it. So the transparency is a key dimension to doing research or sort of non-standard as well as standard research methods. So I would say somehow we end up the same place kind of thing, right? But we need to make it transparent what we do. So, yeah, my name is Kennet Lynggaard from Roskilde University in Denmark. Roskilde University is just outside Copenhagen, about half an hour by train. I'm going to talk about discourse, myths, and emotions. This one is my book. It came out a couple of years ago. If any of you have a special or additional interest, if I haven't kind of disillusioned you after this talk today, and you want to actually know more about it, then this book was out in late 2019, and I introduce a discourse analysis as a research area, methodology in European studies, and then I pick up a number of themes that talk about what kind of data or empirical material is useful for doing different types of discourse analysis. I also talk about kind of research strategies that we can, the kind of choices that we have when we put together our research strategy. And then I go into more substantial areas of talking about how does discourse matters in EU policy making, how does it matter in Europeanization, if you know that area. Also say something about visual discourse, how you can use pictures and visual stuff to say something about discourses and so on. So that's what I do in that book. This was the two texts for today. I'm not going to talk so much about this one. This is more a background article, I guess, which says something about emotions, political emotions, and so on. The first one I'm going to say a little more about. This one is my agenda. And at any point, just put your hand up if you got any questions or comments, right? So first, I'm going to talk about, I've already used the term discourse quite a few times, and I'm going to use it much more. But I'm going to start out by saying what is discourse, and what is a discourse, what is discourse analysis, what can we use it for, and what can't we use it for. I think that any methodology is also defined by what it can't do, right? Because it can't do everything, right? So we also need to think about what can't you do with whichever analytical framework you have. And then I'll move on to give you an example of taken from one of my articles where I look into emotional discourse, right, in European politics, and I look into how pan-European or transnational European NGOs, to what extent they respond to the type of discourse and emotional discourse that is produced by the European Commission. And here, in that part, my conclusions are, it's not what I'm going to spend a whole lot of time on. I'm going to focus on the methodological part and the methods, the choices I've made while I did this. So I kind of try to recall the kind of the process of it. Because you know, when you read a book chapter, a book or an article, you know, you see the results, the product. You don't see the actual process, and typically the process is rather different from the actual product. Right? We usually have a kind of a template for how, when we publish, that we start out with a question, and then theory, and perhaps a little bit of methods. We show the data as well, and then an analysis, and then a conclusion. And that's just not how research happens in the actual process. So there's a difference between the research process and the product. And I think that also goes for when research is presented as we're going to test this hypothesis against some empirical material, and this is our conclusion. You know, typically I would say those people who do hypotheses, I don't do that so much, but those who do that, almost certainly they will have had all sorts of different types of hypotheses doing their work, you know, and reformulated and so on. But the result, it looks like it's much more linear type of process, right? So, but I'm trying to unfold that process, and here you're very welcome to ask questions also, so I may sort of remember as well the more details about how I actually did this work. Okay, so first a little bit, and I can go on for hours and hours, and I think you remember me, remind me it's a maximum of about an hour, right? So I'll probably not get to the end of these slides that I've prepared, but I can send them, and maybe they can be circulated among them. So first of all, what is discourse analysis? Well, what discourse analysis, and I should say my approach to this is that it's a methodology, and it suggests a number of methods and a way of thinking of how to do stuff. So this is discourse analysis is to me different from discourse theory. Discourse theory is more, you know, when we talk about Lynggaard and Mundus and Habermas and so on. I read bits of that as well, but I'm much more focused on discourse analysis as a way to capture and understand and analyze discourses. And in fact, you can analyze discourses. When you've done the discourse analysis, you can analyze these discourses from all sorts of different types of theoretical frameworks. You know, something I've done is that, you know, if I first map, because that's an important thing of doing discourse analysis, to map the discourse. If you do that, for instance, in different countries, how do different governments in Europe think about globalization? What do they think globalization is? Is it an opportunity, you know, or is it really a threat we need to guard ourselves against? You know, those are two different discourses on the same term, you know, globalization. But if you cover that, you know, you map these discourses in a number of countries, then you can begin to perhaps ask questions of, is there a difference between how small states think of globalization compared to large states, or more centralized states compared to less centralized states? So you actually move into different types of theory, right? Theory about small and large states and so on. So what discourse analysis allows you to do, or claims to allow you to do, is to capture political discourse, and also perhaps a novel way to understand political discourse as well. That's the claim. Some of the questions or themes that are approached, and this is how it is now, right? I think there's all sorts of things you can do further with discourse analysis, but this is some of the themes that has been addressed in the past. Political identity, how do states think, or how do groups of individuals articulate their own political identity? Do they feel European or national, or how do they feel? What type of political entity do they feel attachment to? Incidentally, in Europe, people typically, or groups of people will typically feel a number of political identity at any time, right? So you can feel Spanish or Danish at the same time as you feel European, right? But then you can also look into how are these different identities related and so on. But this is one of the themes. Another one is, political cleavages. How do we, in politics, for instance, in labor market politics, discourse analysis can be used to and has been used to studying how do we think about unemployment, right? So unemployment seems to be something that is important in most, at least Western societies. Discourse analysis will have that this is not something that has fallen down from heaven. This is actually a discourse that has evolved over time, even a century or more, right? That unemployment is a key problem in most society because we've come to think about it as a problem. Because it could be different. It could also be that, be nice to have time off, right? And we could do other things, learn to play guitar and whatever, right? But it's still, but we have come to think about unemployment is a problem, also politically, right? But the way we think about unemployment can also be very different according to what type of discourse we adhere to. Just very quickly in general term, often we'll see discourse about unemployment where there'll be some who would see the causes of unemployment as individual causes, So people are not educating themselves for the right positions. They are not active enough in looking for jobs, lazy even, right? That would be one way to look at unemployment, the reasons for unemployment. Because everybody agree that unemployment is a problem, right? Wherever you come from, pretty much, right? But we disagree on the different discourses and the sources of it, the causes of unemployment. So some would look at the individual reasons, right? Others would look at more structural reasons, or suggest more structural reasons for unemployment, So developments in the economy, right, or the educational system is not put together in a way so it supply, the workforce that is needed by businesses, for instance. Right? So they are two different ways to think about what are the reasons for unemployment, and two different discourses. They also have important implications for politics, how we deal with the problem. Should we motivate the individual even further, right, by perhaps cutting benefits, social benefits, so they get a little more stressed and send more, applications and so on? Or should we actually try to sort of deal with some of the structural stuff with the economy and the educational system and so on? So the discourses, we can agree on bits, there will be bits where discourses, they meet, but there will also be differences between these discourses. And they do have important implications for politics as well. So other areas is agenda setting, the type of issues that are put on agendas and media agendas and so on. So it's a rather diverse field, discourse analysis, but are a number of, I think I've put together three common issues for pretty much any discourse analysis. But first I'll just define it. We have two definitions, one by Martin Heyer, another one by Vivian Smith, and the extent to which you sort of know into European politics and society studies, you might well have come across at least Vivian Smith, right? Heyer is perhaps a little more specialized on discourse analysis, but they both deal with European stuff. Heyer defines a discourse as a specific as an ensemble of ideas, concepts, and categories that are produced, reproduced, transformed in a particular set of practices, and through which meaning is given to physical and social realities. So here the concern is, how we give meaning to stuff, right? So how we articulate and give meaning to both sort of social, phenomenons, but also physical phenomenon. We are, in social sciences, we're typically most interested in the social social side of things, right? Vivian Smith have more, she defined discourse as not just about ideas and text, what is said, but also about content, where, when, how, and why it was said. The term refers not only to structure, what is said and where and how, but also to agency, who said what to whom. Do you have these two definitions? How do they compare differences and similarities? What do you think? Yes.
I think possibly Vivian Smith also places a bit more emphasis on maybe like power, or like that it matters who is saying something. So like in context.
The second one,
yeah,
Vivian Smith. Yeah.
Yeah. Like obviously in the context of the EU, for example, like it obviously matters whether something comes from like the Commission or Parliament or etc. Like these are institutions with different power, and so different powers able to create or to sustain certain discourse. I think that's more so in the second definition than the first one, I would say.
Yes. Great. You know, they are both concerned, and any discourse analysis is concerned, is probably more on the structural side than many other political science, perhaps rational choice type of models and so on. So it's more structural. But one of the differences between these two, they easily understand each other. I don't know, I don't think they've actually written anything together, but they could easily, right? But Vivian Smith, I think you're right. She's more focused perhaps on agency, right? She's still, you know, structured, discursive structure is still, you know, key to understand discourses and what they do, what kind of power is embedded in discourses, but she's probably a little more focused on also on the agency, who says what, right, to whom, and so on. But this is a sort of a general definitions of discourse. You'll see variations, but this is what discourse is about. Meaning systems, right? Meaning attached to a phenomenon, like, you know, unemployment, the example I just gave you. And when we attach something, a meaning to a phenomenon, then it has real consequences. The way that we think about a phenomenon will have real consequences. That's the assumption for politics, among others. Oh, did I miss that one? Yes. No, this was the first characteristic of discourse analysis, that discourse is the research object of any discourse analysis. So you focus on a discourse, and then you might also have other focus, but one focus is that you want to understand a of several discourses. Another common characteristic of any discourse analysis is that we are interested in the implications or the product of discourses. In what way does a discourse or discursive conflicts or several discourses, how do they matter for something else? For me, I'm a political scientist, so I think about how does it matter for politics. So how does a discourse, you know, articulate positions for different type of agents? Right? A discourse, the claim would be, is that it will, you know, set up some rules for what kind of actors are legitimate actors within a particular discourse. What are the actors that can speak with authority and legitimacy compared to those who have less of a voice? So as an example, in European politics, I think maybe it's like 15, 20 years ago that a Commission white paper came out focusing on something like good governance in the European Union. And one of the things that this discourse that this was a part of this Commission white paper is that good governance means that we need to listen to societal voices and interest organizations and so on. So a discourse like that would make room for these kind of actors, as opposed to discourses which would say, well, it's governments that are the most important, perhaps parliaments and so on. So in a discourse, there will be positions for some. It will include some actors, but it will also exclude others. It will also say something about what type of knowledge is useful or relevant in a particular context. What do we need knowledge about? What kind of knowledge do we need? If we have a discourse which have evolved over a century or so about unemployment. Well, then we need, knowledge about, levels of unemployment and perhaps the reasons for unemployment and so on. We don't need information about how people maybe be able to use their time on other stuff. At least not in that discourse. Right? So. We also have already said a little bit about this. Discourse analysts are interested in the structure and the boundaries of a discourse. Where does it begin and start and so on, and how does discourses, to what extent do they overlap or are in conflict with each other? And one of the reasons we have an interest in that is because then we'll be able to say something about the level of political conflict. We may also be able to say something about what can we expect of the possibility of political compromises. If we can find a common understanding of a phenomenon, then we might also be able to find a political compromise. Yes. So, in general, what discourse analysis can be used for is the claim would be it says something about politics, and it constitutive is what we sometimes says for politics. It sets out the frame for politics. Sometimes we use the word it gives a space of possibility. It will not, a discourse analysis will not tell us something about if we have mapped the discourse and this is how it looks like and so on. And we've been very systematic and so on. It will not follow that we can say, well, then this will be the political decision, or this will be the development we can expect. So there is not a one-to-one relationship, but the claim is that it would set out a space of possibility. We can say something about, we can expect that it's within this area that a political decision can be made. There will be some political decisions that are inside the discourses, the current discourse, and there will also be some which are very unlikely because they are not articulated. They are simply not part of the discourse. Right? So this is what can be used to. Discourse analysis or discourse will also be saying something about what kind of frame, discursive or meaning system do actors need to articulate themselves within in order to be seen as legitimate and relevant actors. So if we use the example from before of unemployment, I imagine it's not very different here in Spain, or I know you from all over Europe and also outside Europe. But in many places, as I said, unemployment is a problem. But there will typically be, small groupings which would say something differently. They would say, well, actually, maybe it's not such a problem. And then when we have a small party, and incidentally they're called the alternative, and it's a small party. They are one of the, I think, probably the only party in Parliament, and we got loads of parties in Parliament, in Danish Parliament, small ones. So I think it's the only party which has kind of an idea that the Danish citizens, they should have a basic benefit pay, regardless of they have a job or not. Right? So you can actually decide that I don't want to work. So I think we call it a citizen payment. That's kind of an issue which pops up here and there. But so here they begin to sort of challenge the idea that having a job is key to our lives. Right? But they also not really listened to, right? They don't really have much of an influence in today's society. So this is an example of how the discourse, even the hegemonic discourses, they will include a number of actors, and you can be within these discourses, articulate yourself and your positions, and be taken seriously, and be legitimate. But you can also be outside, and no one will really listen to you, right? Or at least maybe your friends will, right? But you won't have any influence or much of influence. So this is just to say that a discourse analysis in a European, in a national, but also in international context, it has been used for long as a research methodology, right, or way to do research, discourse analysis. In European studies, it's probably a more recent phenomenon, perhaps around the 2000s. I'll show you a few numbers here in a bit. So it has established itself over the past couple of decades as a position, and you don't really, I think, have to sort of articulate this position again all the time, right? As this is actually a position which is allowed to take. Right? It is accepted by most that this is a position, whether you agree with it or you think it's just mumble jumble. It is kind of accepted as a position, but it's not mainstream. It's a little short of us, at least. This is just quickly to show this from the first chapter in my book, where I also, cover the scope of this research area with discourse analysis in Europe. And this is just a simple count of articles from some of the key journals in EU studies. Do you know them? This is from, I think this will also be, of course, also be colored by that I'm a political scientist, right? But Journal of European Public Policy, Journal of Common Market Studies, West European Politics, European Union Politics are at least some of the most central. There will be a number of others as well, but these are the ones I look at here. And then for a period of, 20 years, I searched databases for articles which would have discourse as a theme, at least, that were touched upon. Then I looked at the abstracts to see, is it actually, is there a serious dealing with this, at least to some extent? And then I'll put them into my sort of descriptive, it's not really statistics, is it? I just counted the number of articles. But you can see that over time, it's had a spiky development. So it's kind of taken off in around 2000. So this is just to show that I'm not just making this up. So a little bit about what discourse analysis can't do. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
Sorry, I just wondered if you could talk, if you're going to talk a bit about absences in discourses
Yeah.
as well, and how you manage the analysis.
That's a great question. So that's kind of a question of how do you study what's not there? It's obviously difficult, but there are things you can do, I think.
Yes, I have a question, which is...
I just need to just make a few notes for my answer. Yes.
So it's related to the not strategic use in discourse, but incompetence, you could say, in the use of discourse.
Yeah.
And I think I increasingly wonder about it in the context of European politics, where you have a situation in which many people speak in a language not their own, and then there's sort of a frequent production of these empty signifiers which are sort of compromise solutions, and then people can mean many different things under them, or sometimes just use them to echo the discourse without meaning very much with them. So I'm just wondering whether you come across these and how have you seen them addressed in the literature?
Yeah. Okay, I'll just say a little more about this, and then I'll try and say something about these two questions here. after that. This is just to say a little bit about what discourse analysis can't do. It can't supply us explanations with reference to individuals. Right? You can't say that it was, van der Leyen, President of the European Commission. She was the one that started this discourse or changed this discourse, because individuals are not the sources of change in discourse. Discourses are collective stuff, right? And this, so it can't supply, explanations from with point of departure in individual. This is different from. Do you know what methodological individualism means? It means, the kind of research which will say that with the point of departure, it's actors, it's humans that do stuff. Right? So they will supply explanations with point of departure in individuals. From a discourse analytical perspective, there, because we have a social ontology, right? Discourses are something that evolves among us. It's not the property of an individual. It's the property of groups of individuals, right? So we cannot, supply these explanations. But we can say that discourses do something, right? But it's a discourse that does something. It can also be collective actors, right? Agency can do something, but not individuals. For instance, where if we have a question of why a minister in charge of labor market stuff in the Council of Ministers, whether that minister will choose to be for or against or not vote for a particular directive, discourse analysis can't tell us anything about that. Rational choice, rational institutional choice, and so on will supply very clever explanations for that. Discourse analysis would be able to say something about perhaps, that there are some discourses that frame the choice, the space of possibility for the ministers in the council. So we'll be able to say something about, well, actually, at this point in history, it can be appropriate to vote in favor of more strict environmental standards, even if it has costs for firms and for countries and so on, because there is a very strong environmental and climate discourse currently, one which have evolved over the past, like 50 years or so. That's what we can say, but we can't say something about. Yeah?
I'm sorry, I'm just now thinking about how many students have talked to me about looking at the discourse of, for instance, leaders.
Yeah.
Right? So, I wonder if this is a bit confusing does that mean that I don't know, but I wonder if there are any students in the room now thinking this means that I can't look at the discourse of a particular actor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, you can. Yes. Yeah. Oh, of course you can. Because at the same time it is actors who speak. Right? But in order for it to be a discourse, you'll have to identify it as a meaning system that involves groups of actors, right? Otherwise, if it doesn't add up to a meaning system in any systematic way, then we are not talking about discourse, then we'll talk about rhetoric, rather. Right? But it can still be very important also to look into leaders, political leaders, prime ministers, and so on, ministers. But then we'll also make an argument for that they represent something more than just themselves. Then we will say, well, the Spanish discourse as as represented by our prime minister. Then we need to develop an argument and say that's a fair thing to do, and we also need to say, well, that obviously there are other voices, national voices, alternatives, and so on, but we'll take this as an estimation of the official representation of Denmark and Spain and so on. So obviously that's still what you want to know, but it will be representing something more than just the Prime Minister if you study that. So this afternoon, those of you who turn up for discourse analysis, I'll say much more about how we can actually do this and what type of texts and how can we read them and so on as well. Okay. So I've said enough about that, I think. Now, also identifying the historical origin of a discourse is essentially impossible from a discourse analytical perspective. This means somehow that we, as you remember, maybe you remember that discourses are the objective of any discourse analysis. That's what we want to know something about. So of this, it follows that we can't actually, identify the origin of our research object, which can be a little challenging because a discourse never we can't say that a particular point in time, this is where it started. Well, one example of where you could say that this was really a major event and possibly the closest we get to, and still it's not the origin of a discourse. That was 9/11 and what followed on the war on terror. Right? And this was obviously, physically a really super event, right? And this discourse on war on terror was followed very quickly after. But from discourse analysis, we would also look at before this, we would look into discourses of war and terror, perhaps, and see how they merged and what that means. What does it mean that it became articulated as now we are again in a war against terror. Obviously, this will have super implications, by the way, for who we can actually go and fight and how we can justify, decisions for going into sovereign states here and there. If we can say, well, there are terrorists here and we are at war with them. Right? So this is another example of how discourses, they do actually matter also in the field. So here, from a discourse analytical perspective, discourses, they don't sort of pop up by one event. They will merge, perhaps transform, and so on. So this doesn't, if it doesn't follow that we should give up. It doesn't mean that we will have to, set up an analytical frame for the time that we cover in our research. So we have to say, make an argument for why we look at a particular time period when we study a particular set, a particular discourse, a set of discourses. Right? So if it was war on terror, then maybe we will say, well, we want something after and something before as well, and then argue for when we start in our analysis. But it becomes an analytical choice when we start and end our analysis. So, and there's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to get through the second part, but I'll say bits about it. But I'll just, say a little bit about the questions that was asked. So about how we can begin to maybe not study but understand what is not there, the discourses which are silenced, which is of course also from a discourse analytical perspective super important. What are the discourses which are not articulated? And because it matters for so many things would be our assumption, right? The silent voices will be, are marginalized also in politics. I think a number of ways that we can begin to perhaps also to study that. That would be, also have a focus on alternative discourse and those who are articulated outside of the formal, if it's political system, right? So maybe the more critical voices of NGOs and social groups and so on, in order to also to capture the alternatives. That would be one way to do it. Another way would be to perhaps to do comparative studies as well. So choose different cases where you can, where you can see there are a difference. There's probably a difference between, the voices that are, the discourses that have evolved in a particular context in a member state, if it's Europe, compared to another member state, for instance. And then compare, and then you can perhaps begin to say something about what is not there in the case where you don't see it, because it's over here. So comparative, you could also do comparative discourse analysis is what I'm saying. I think maybe also, I guess you could also make more of perhaps a theoretical argument, so you imagine what could have been there, right? Sometimes, and this is not just from discourse analysis, but actually it's not really for discourse analysis, but I think it can also be interesting sometimes to make a counterfactual analysis, right? So where you think about what if this was not there, what could we have imagined was there instead? So that's a counterfactual, and that doesn't have, it sounds maybe a little more jumbled, but there are actually methods to also do counterfactual studies in a systematic way, where let me just give you a quick example of it. I've done a little bit of work on kind of the relationship between European integration, globalization, and national societies. To say something about how can we begin to study the implications of European integration compared to globalization, the effects on the national level. How can we know that something is on the national level is caused by that we are a member of the European Union compared to globalization, right? Because there's been lots of research on which typically called Europeanization, which will say, well, in Denmark or in any member state, this institution or policies have been put in place because we are a member of the European Union, right? And sometimes it's rather clear if there is a particular, directive, so we have to do that, but there are also lots and lots of stuff where we claim that it's because we are a member of the European Union, where we can easily imagine, at least to some extent, it could also be more global phenomena that are actually having an impact. Right? So how can we begin to differentiate between these two? And that's difficult, but one way to begin to do it, I'm not sure it's the best one, or it's certainly not the only one, but then, that would be to imagine what if we were, this state was not a member of the European Union. Can we still imagine that this would have happened? Right? And then you will have to, to use also theoretical arguments for that it's possible that it could have happened because of more broader global, so we have to substantiate the effects of the global at the national level. So there are methods for this. But I think where I would start was actually also in this order I suggested, look at the more critical voices outside of the more formal structures, political system, or whatever it is, NGOs and so on. That would be where I would start. But it is obviously a difficult question. So there was something about the strategic use of discourse. This is something that is less studied. It's not studied, but it's less studied, the strategic use of discourse, because typically, the assumption would be that discourses, they somehow work behind our backs. We don't really think about it. We just operate within the discourse we are. How many of you would think about, if we haven't just talked about it, that unemployment is actually not something that has fallen down from heaven? It could actually be different, right? We just operate within discourses typically without thinking much about it. That would be most analysis which would depart from that assumption, and that would also be very common. I mean, I think that's very true. I think it's also true that we also often, also in our daily practices, use discourses strategically. And in order to do that, we have to, know the discourses we are operating within. We need to be able to reflect upon it and then find ways of using discourses strategically. I'll just say that I think it's possible, and there is also some concepts to try to understand it. But for instance, at my university, and you can think about other examples, if there is something I like to push, a new program or something, a new study program or whatever it might be, or we need, then because I've been at my university for almost 2 decades, I know exactly what arguments to use in different contexts. Right? There are some where I will say that for pedagogical reasons, it's really important that we do this and so on, and we get more critical students and reflective and then I also know there's some fora where I have to say, well, we're gonna make money on this, the cost efficient, right? So we also do it in our daily practices, I think. But there's not much discourse analysis. I would have a focus on that. Are there any other questions? Yes?
I'm wondering, you talked a bit about when to use discourse or like what it's good for.
Yeah.
I think many of us are sort of, when we say like we want to do policy analysis or discourse analysis, or I think a lot of students are like, discourse analysis is incredibly complex, right?
Mm.
And so I feel like when you say discourse analysis is the best way to do research, or like what are its advantages compared to, say, for example, qualitative content analysis or thematic analysis, or why do discourse analysis then? Because it's so complicated.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure it's complicated. I think that's perhaps even kind of a discourse. They know that it's complicated, and it will perhaps also keep some people from it, right? So from doing it. And this afternoon, I'm going to say more about the practice. How we can read a text and try to really specifically try to identify discourses in texts. I wouldn't say that it's the best way to do research. Not at all. I think before obviously I'm a discourse analyst, right? To the tip of my nails. But I think I'm even more of a pluralist first. So I think that first of all, I think any research and methodology to do research should be understood, and also, which should raise critiques of research based on their own starting point. Right? So I don't think it makes much sense for me to make a strong critique of rational choice understandings of the world, and I'm actually quite happy to also teach that kind of thing, right? And I think there's lots of you can use rational choice, institutional theory to understand decision making with, and it doesn't make much sense for me to say, well, no, this is much more. This is about discourse. They only do this because of these discourse, because they're doing something else, right? So I think you have to understand a particular framework based on their own assumptions. But discourse analysis can be used for a number of things to understand, political conflicts between different understandings of a phenomenon. What are the reasons for? What are the effects of globalization? This is actually, a huge thing. Is globalization something that we see as an opportunity? The government, for instance, see as an opportunity, and we should get ready for this, and we should compete internationally, get ready to compete with international firms and businesses and so on. Or is it actually something? Is it a threat against our welfare state system, and we should, guide ourselves, govern ourselves against this? We should have an antidote somehow, a medicine against the global stuff, which will have huge consequences for the type of politics that we see that follows from that. So there are a number of questions it can be used for political identity and so on, and said, there are also a number of questions. We just can't say, why Minister XX made this choice in the room, pushing the button for or against a particular political proposal and so on. So it depends on the research question, I think I've already spoken an hour, and I think so. I don't know how much I should go on with the example, or I should keep it for this afternoon, perhaps. What do you think? Because I don't want to lose too many.
Vera's question about competence.
Mm.
Language, I'm not sure who.
No, not entirely, but it's related. If you say that there is not so much done or already on the strategic use of discourse, I think it's probably more difficult to factor in the fact that sometimes strategic use is not even on purpose.
Yeah.
The kinds of examples I have in mind are, you create a kind of compromise concept in European politics like open strategic autonomy.
Yeah.
It does not mean very much, and many people think something differently under it, but it is for the purposes of sort of signaling the right kind of language used by everyone
Yeah.
in their speeches. And then the question is, as an analyst, how do you deal with these, which proliferate at the European level, right? Is often how the European politics works.
So about, that this is kind of a multilingual context, advancing some and disadvantaging others and so on. Is that what it's about? And I think that I don't know. I mean, one of this is at least one of the reasons why I think it's also super interesting to look at the visual discourse. I think that's arguably extraordinarily important in a multilingual, multicultural context. It's the European one. This is a tiny little, area of discourse analysis. And there's not a whole lot of things. There was just you gave me an opportunity to point to that because I think it's really interesting. I think it's almost certainly true that the language. I mean, we don't actually sort of. Discourse analysis is typically not sort of kind of a linguistic methods, right? Where we go into different languages and so on, and what does it mean compared to each other. But I think the phenomenon that most of us speak, perhaps our second language when we speak in a European context, English typically also matters. But whether it advantages some over others, I don't know. What the effects of it are, I'm not sure. I think there's, I mean, like in most or in all political contexts, the general there is also a general format of the discourse that evolves in European context. I don't know whether this is anywhere close to an answer to what you're saying, but you can see something I've looked into is it's speeches made in the European Parliament. There are all sorts of course, nationalities there. But you can also see there is kind of a common format for some of the speeches where you address the speaker and dear sirs and so on, and then you typically start out by we're looking forward to working with all these different actors and so on, and you end up with how important Europe is and so on. So there's a common format which have developed over time. But I guess. This is, so I don't know whether that matters. Well, I think if strategic use of discourse, whether it can be, something that you don't do on purpose. I think for it to be strategic, I think you would probably, by definition, think it will be on purpose. Otherwise, it would be, that you are articulating a discourse without thinking much about it. One example of how you can study whether discourse is used strategically is perhaps to look into how actors they would articulate a discourse in different contexts. So if political leaders they say something at the European level, but something different at the national level, then I think that would be a good indicator of that they're acting strategically. Right? There's something you can say nationally. There's something different you should say and can say internationally or European. I think the second part, because that's just another hour as well, and I would rather not get started on it if I can only. There are some questions, then I can talk with those who turn up later on about this second part, perhaps, this afternoon. And we take questions now instead. Yeah, there's one up there.
But actually, sorry, because I forgot, any questions should be made with the microphone.
I know it wasn't the best answer to you up there. I was trying. I don't know. I mean, my first answer would probably be, I actually don't know, but I was trying to see if I could say anything.
I was wondering if there is this discourse analysis conducted on academia itself, where these concepts and ideas get embedded in the structure and you still create some kind of power, and if there could be like this auto-ethnography of academics who could deal with this, like to become self-aware of this structure they create with new concepts, new ideas. Yes. So if you have done any work on that.
Yeah. So examples of it, or whether it can be done.
So if there is an extensive work on that, or you got into.
I think it could definitely be done. Study academic discourses, and the power that is involved in academic discourses. How it excludes some research ideas and topics and so on, and include others. I think it is even kind of what we do when we define literatures, right? We'll include some literature, but we'll also exclude some literature. But whether I can think about examples of someone who's done that, I can't actually think about it.
Sorry, I think feminists, critical feminists have done,
Yeah.
and also.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Of course, you're right. Yes, that was a good reminder. There has been done research also, for instance, this is what I know of, the study of collegiums, right? The study of what are students like you asked to read, what is on the reading lists. So I know there has been done research on that, and obviously the conclusion is, what I remember, it was in the international studies, that by far the most of the literature is written by men, right? That's at least one of the conclusions, and it's pretty much the same literature.
Cited, not necessarily written.
Okay, it's not the research.
So it's gatekeeping, isn't it? So
Yeah.
it's about the journals and it's why. So there's been quite a lot of work on the rise of feminist journals. So why do you have feminism-specific journals? It's because they were writing,
Oh, yeah.
and not getting published.
Yeah.
So it's not that you didn't have plenty of women writing for a long time.
Oh,
It was just that they weren't getting published. So I would just make the difference between
yeah.
writing, publishing, cite, and then
Yeah.
citations is of course a
The study that you reminded me of was a study of what is put on reading lists, I think in international relations courses at universities, and there by far the majority is done by men, right? This is one of the things that they looked into.
Also just, I think is that last question? Yeah. So I was when I was in the UK, I was working with Pearson after the UK government changed the curriculum for politics A-levels. So there were a group of academics that were consulted, and one of the things that we know, so the government specifies what readings, certain readings have to be on certain subject matter, and there were no women at all.
Okay,
And we had to really fight.
so they actually give you the authors.
But there weren't enough, and then when it went out into the broader kind of debate about it, there was a real uproar about the fact that nearly everybody there was white
Yeah.
and male.
I hadn't thought about that you could even be that detailed on a government level, that you actually get the authors. I thought it was bad enough in Denmark where there are rules for and national rules for what we must teach, what kind of school of thought we must teach in international relations. But even going further down to actually say who should be read, that's even more detailed. There's one up there. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Otherwise, they are recording on the video,
Thanks for the presentation so far. I'm actually curious, will you speak about this topic that you have on the slide right now, content analysis and computer-assisted content analysis, and how it relates to discourse analysis during the workshop this afternoon? Or because if not, could you maybe speak briefly about it and how to operationalize this?
Content analysis.
And discourse analysis, how to operationalize them, how to make them work together.
Yeah. Well, I could do, but it would take another half an hour. that would be quick.
We have time until 11, so if there are no questions, I think we will perfectly.
Yeah. I could start out by saying that, content analysis, I wouldn't do that on its own, I would always do the qualitative side of the discourse analysis, where you look into and try to identify what is the discourse on sustainability or on globalization or whatever is your interest. You have to look into what meaning is attached to it. But in combination with that kind of study, I think you can also use content analysis and even do a few graphs and counting words and so on to say something about the scope of the discourse. So I'll say a little more about that. So now I'm going to talk about this article and particularly on the methods that I used to develop this research. And it was about the general question, and I'm including this because the point of departure is that you need a research question in order to be able to develop a sensible way to study the question. And this is also because it's not a standard method. I think it's probably the same thing if it's more standard methods, but definitely for non-standard methods like discourse analysis, you need a question. It's research question oriented. Right? So that's why I start with that. And I set out to study with a couple of colleagues. We had a research project some years ago on what are the role of political myths in the process of European integration. And we actually set out to want to say something about political advocacy, how can it be used in day-to-day politics, political myths. So defining political myths, this is from the literature. Myth is the work on a common narrative that grants significance to the political conditions and experiences of a social group. So here, a myth is also distinguished from a discourse, but it's a narrative. Sometimes in the literature, even in the academic literature, narratives and discourse are kind of conflated. I think also using the literature, it is actually two different things. They are close to each other, but it's not the same. And because we are academics, we like to be precise in our definitions. So, narratives, there has been written a lot about that. What is a narrative and how do it look like technically and so on. But what it's definitely defined by is that it has a plot. It has an end, a middle, and it has a beginning, an end, and a middle. Right, setting the scene, something happens, and then there's a resolution. So there's a plot. A discourse doesn't necessarily have a plot. Right? So a narrative is more than a discourse. Myths are also more than narratives. They also appeal to feelings. So myths, from this perspective, the way that it's defined, I defined it in this article that it's a discourse. It's also a narrative on top of that, but it also appeals to feelings. That's what is key to a myth. So it's kind of a super discourse. Yes?
So can you give another example of a myth?
Yes. Here it is. Green Europe, social Europe, is an example of what we call political myths. By the way, the word myths, as you could see also in the definition, it doesn't mean that it's not true. In fact, it is true from my perspective, just like it's true as a discourse, right? And discourse are as true and real as states, right? So there are phenomena out there which can be studied. So Green Europe as a discourse, but also as a narrative, I guess, they are associated with, of course, the practice of environmental legislation. Also, that in Europe we tend to do very well, perform very well on the environmental protection. Also, that the EU is a global leader in environmental regulation and climate and so on, and pushing that forward. That's how we typically think about that. There are also alternatives, I'm talking about the sort of the most common way to, when we think about Green Europe, this is the kind of thing that we think about. There are obviously also competing environmental discourses. One, and this is probably almost certainly the environmental discourse, the general one which have the upper hand, is that economic growth and environmental protection goes hand in hand. Right? We can still have growth, but we can also have environmental protection. This is one discourse which is sometimes called ecological modernization, where you can green technologies and so on. It's also a business at the same time, so we can still have growth, but also protect our environment. And then there are the discourse which is typically associated with green organizations, NGOs, activists, green parties and so on, which would say that the protection of the environment is a non-reducible ideal for society, and the climate and so on. It's the most important thing. If we also have growth at the same time, that might for some be okay, but it's the green agenda which is the most important for a society. Yes.
I have a question on that. To what extent do you think, so like something like a Green Deal or like ecological modernization is very sort of, I think, present there, right? Like, I mean, it speaks, it breathes that premise. To what extent do you think that sort of like, kind of like Maxine also asked, like about absence of discourse, like alternative discourse, like degrowth, or to what extent do you think that has potential to penetrate kind of this hegemonic discourse that we see in the EU right now? Is that something where there is a lot of like tension, like back and forth between that, or do you really think that is like green growth, ecological modernization discourse is going to stay sort of dominant for the time being? Like, I guess it's a bit of like a future-oriented question, so I guess it's difficult, but do you see anything like shifting there?
Yeah, I mean, on future-oriented, I would just say that I think discourse, when we map discourses, it kind of also set out what we can expect of the future, what we can, based on these discourses that we have now, what can we expect of the future? So it's not like we can't have any expectations from a discourse in a political perspective. So the answer to whether I think that where the basic sort of balance in the discourse is that economic growth and environmental protection is kind of on par compared to where it's more than that the objective of society is to protect the environment, right, which is the alternative one. I think it's much more likely that we carry on like we have done for quite some years. Right? But I'll also say, the reason why we have this in the first place, this is something I've actually studied in detail empirically. If we go back late 60s, early 70s, it was completely absent with, any thoughts, concerns about the environment in European politics. This is something that did not happen until typically is traced back to 1973. And the book, the report Limits to Growth, right? Because it was done, among other things, I think also because it was done by business leaders and so on. It's about this report, and we have to do something if otherwise the world will collapse in 100 years from now. Right? And it was an international bestseller. The ideas associated with this, moved back and forth outside the EU political system, but it also entered in some sort of more marginal organizations, and then into the parliament, and later on you can see in different parts of the commission, and then it also turned into political decisions later on, and you can see now a Green Deal, right? So it has actually changed if we look at the long run. If anything, if you could say that this discourse, which has the upper hand now, you don't get many politicians who would not think that protecting the environment and concerns for climate change is also important. Right? It is kind of in the hegemonic discourse, or the discourse that has the upper hand. The way we do it and how important it is, is much more a debate. Right? But you can imagine that this could also change over time, but it's typically take a long time. For this agenda to be here in the first place has taken 30, 40 years. That's all. So. And then there are some ideas about social Europe, what it entails. For my study here, because there has been done quite some empirical study, I assumed, and referred to the literature, of course, in my research, that discourses on this exist, and also that it has kind of a narrative structure. So what I also wanted to say something about, in particular, are they also myths? They're discourses, and they are also narratives, but are they also myths? So I focused, because that was the dimension which would allow us to categorize the narrative discourse as myths, is they also appeal to emotions. So that's what I wanted to study here. And I'm coming to the content analysis in a bit. That's what I'm preparing. So I wanted to look into how transnational NGOs, they respond to narrative discourses coming out of the European Commission. So I looked at a time period here, which I argued for analytically, and then I selected 4 different NGOs, which is also, I think, the biggest ones here on the labor market, Business Europe, and then the trade union side. The European Environmental Bureau is an umbrella organization dealing with environmental stuff and climate stuff, and they've done so since the early 70s. And it's an umbrella organization, means it organizes, I think, more than 200 individual environmental NGOs. So they have been involved in politics for ages. I think, by the way, just to tie this up to something that we talked about, I think they're pretty good at using discourse, green discourse, statistically, because they will, in their own fora, express that protecting the environment is an ideal above everything else. When they negotiate with the Commission, and the Commission, they will call them when so do you think this is a good idea? How can we do it? Then they will argue, well, growth is also okay. So they will, operate within this environment. And a platform for social NGOs of various kinds, also a major organization. And just to define emotion, what it is, because it has been defined in all sorts of ways, and it also comes from neuroscience, among other things, where it can be seen as bodily arousals, is the word that they use sometimes, right? And as chemical processes in the brain, and where they sort of can put stuff on your head and then show you pictures, and then you'll see that something happens, and how they measure emotions in that area. I draw more on political psychology, where we both can talk about individual but also particularly collective emotions. And also, and this is where we begin to move into where I actually kind of like to end up, that I can study this by using discourse analysis, is that emotions are also intersubjective, collective, constructed stuff. Right? Here, this is also when we begin to talk about how can we use emotions in various ways strategically. Are they completely involuntary and uncontrollable, or are they a potential source of political action? You know, can you use emotions for political stuff? I think as always, I think it's probably we can do both. Doesn't mean that that it should all be mixed up. It means that we can perhaps begin to study them both more individual, but also the strategic use of it. I'll drop that one. And so to come to how I've used content analysis, and I said before, the more qualitative side of things has already been done. Discourses, the meaning of sustainability and so on, has been identified by the literature. There are discourses, there are also narratives. So I would always do that side of things as well. But here I will also say something about how you can perhaps use some software and content analysis, also in supplement to the more qualitative side of things. So how much do you know about content analysis? Do you know about it? Or should I say a little bit? Or should you just move to how I did it?
They should know.
Good. I'll move to how I did it. See, what I did is I used, do you know, in Vivo, there are different softwares. In Vivo is the one that I have used the past few years, some years now, and I think I used to that the only numbers in my research was pretty much page numbers, but in recent years I've also begun to count words in various ways in combination with the more qualitative. I think this is also qualitative and it also non-standard. It's not about statistical significance and so on, right? But it's a way also to begin to put some numbers on it. So Envivo is a software you import. You can import documents. You can explore these documents in various ways, make searches and quite sort of sophisticated searches and as well. By a few taps you can get in the documents that you've uploaded the 1,000 most used words in all these documents. We say I only want words which are longer than 5 letters, for instance. So you take out if and so on, and then you make word trees as well, where you get the most important or the most used words and how they relate to other words and so on. So there are various ways to visualize this. And you can code within this system where you can, color code, for instance, sustainability. If you tap in sustainability in your document archive, then all bits in these documents will come up where sustainability has been used. You can get, you can ask for to have a short context around the key term that you're looking at, or you can get the broader context as well. Ask for that and read around that perhaps in order to identify whether the way that sustainability has been used in the different, in each context is also the way that it matches the discourse that you're trying to say, the scope of, something about the scope of. So there are various things you can do here. So this is my material, what I used to study discourses and particularly emotions. Emotional discourse is what it really is. And this is follows from what I said, that discourses, they are as real as anything else. They are as real as a state or whatever to me. So it's something that is studied empirically. Here I used documents to study it, and this is probably the most common material to study discourses. You can do other stuff as well, but documents are probably the most common. In order to get some, continuity in the sort of the format of the document for each of these actors, European Environmental Bureau, Social Platform, the unions, the Business Europe, I used annual reports from these organizations from about 2006 or something to 2016, so I could look at over time. So here describe, these are the closest that we get to annual reports. Some annual reports here. I'll say a little bit about that. They looked very much like each other, but I also make some notes to be transparent. If there were a couple of reports which stood out, for whichever reason, that stood out, some of these annual reports. Maybe they've been particularly busy in 1 year and was only half the size that it used to be, or something. So I use that annual reports in particular, and you can see here how many of each. So first of all, they are not, obviously not completely comparable, or they're not completely comparable across the different groups of actors here, collective actors. But I argue that you can compare patterns. That's what you can do. This is just a green screenshot of the software in Vivo. And this is not something, I don't teach it at my university, but some of my colleagues do. So I'm not, I was about to say, hand in nature, but that would be quite opposite to what I'm actually talking about here. But typically I've not in the past been sort of very technical and with numbers and so on. And that's just the kind of research I've done. It's not what is better or worse. But here I actually kind of learned myself. I got some research money funding, which is typically, I think, what we need to teach ourselves new methods. Otherwise we tend to, use what we already know. But I actually had some extra time here to try to explore some new ways of doing things. So I taught myself, I think I did actually maybe a 2-day course at some point. They are often available at the universities and also online. And then I got a manual and just played around with it. I think the biggest obstacle is probably just to download it and click on the program, and then it's quite intuitive. And you can do all sorts of sophisticated stuff, much more sophisticated than what I've been doing. So now I'm beginning to develop indicators to do the content analysis. So I assume there's a narrative and a discourse, and then I want to study how these are received by the NGOs. Discourse which are embedded in this report, Europe 2020, which was a major deal. It's from 2010, I believe, where there was all sorts of strategies for smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth. And there was objectives, very specified ones, where what are the targets in different areas, and how should we get to that target, and so on. I was not interested in whether these targets was reached or not. Incidentally, of course they're not. I was interested in how this work as a discourse. How does it appeal to the actors involved? And obviously I looked into the report, but I took these sort of key terms in the report. Smart growth is related to innovation, knowledge economy and so on. Sustainability and inclusive growth. Inclusive is kind of that you on the, for instance, on the labor market, all sorts of sexes and genders and disabilities and so on should be included on the labor market. That kind of thing. You know, that society should be inclusive. While there's also growth. So these are three indicators used. What I searched on was and sustainable, inclusive, exclusive. But also these are clearly not, you know, a one-to-one associated with inclusive, exclusive, with social Europe, you know, inclusive society. Just like sustainability is not necessarily associated with the green Europe. In fact, you might even say that sustainability over time has developed to become, you know, more of what you said very early on, an empty signifier, right, which can be associated with all sorts of meaning. I think it's often associated with, you know, environmental protection and so on. It should be sustainable for the environment, but it's also come to be used by all sorts of other things. You know, sustainable budgets, for instance, right, is completely different. Often nothing to do with protection of the environment, but it's sustainable. And you know, we can't really imagine that it's not good to be sustainable. That's always good. But here I also did a qualitative analysis, so I can see whether sustainability was actually associated with the discourse of green Europe, or it was actually associated back to sustainable budgets. So this was just a simple word count of these, of inclusive, exclusive, unsustainable, and sustainable, and smart. First of all, smart, we'll see, but this, they refer to a little bit. Typically these are, because as I said, I also looked into the sort of the context where it was written. I didn't just count the words. Typically this is where they just refer to the actual report for the Commission, you know, to the title. So one conclusion here is that one conclusion I made that when the Commission sort of draws on discourse and you know, articulate on an already existing discourse, something is happening. It's boosting discourse, but also, you know, it's the existing discourse which are boosted. You know, smart knowledge. I also went into to make searches on knowledge and invention and innovation and so on. There's nothing there, pretty much nothing. So existing discourses can be boosted by the report which came out here around 10. And it's pretty systematic, you know, over time. Just around where the commission sent out this report, there's more mention of it, of these, that we need more to be more inclusive and we need to more sustainable and so on. In these NGOs. So they are listening. I should also say, this is part of sort of reconstructing the research process, that I did all sorts of searches. This was not a linear, but pretty far from it, a linear process. You know, I've done all sorts of things to figure out how I could actually identify patterns in this. So this is just a simple word count. So I did a few, already mentioned them, a few observation or conclusions based on that they don't just relate to the report, they also, the NGOs, they are listening. It's also boosting their articulation of green and social Europe. And it's quite systematic across the four organizations, except Business Europe stand out a little bit. And it's also quite clear that the organizations are also more receptive to not just existing discourse, but also the discourses which are of their particular, which are within their particular area, right? So European Environmental Bureau was also, it also particularly boosted their articulation of its program with Green Europe and so on. then went on to, now we know sort of a little bit about that there was something happened around there 9-10, you know, because there's also a time period of preparation of this report where in Brussels, sometimes called the Brussels bubble, you know, they begin to talk in bars and elsewhere and meetings and so on about, oh, this report is coming up. So you can easily imagine that something happens also before the actual publication of the report. But something did happen around 9, 10, 11 there. So, but was it also emotional, the way that it was, was emotions involved in these discourses? And this is the last bits I'm gonna say. Again, I did all sorts of things. And you know, the point with these is not how they go up and down, just to make that point clear, first of all. What I did here is that I tried to find an indicator for something being emotional. What I came up with after some time and using literature is that when political actors, they begin to talk about justice and democracy and so on, there seemed to be something extraordinarily at play. It's not just day-to-day stuff. Right? So I made that argument by using, I think, actually some pretty classical literature that when we talk about political language, when it involves justice and democracy and so on, it means that something is at play. So I combined the indicators from before of sustainability and social Europe, Green Europe and social Europe with justice and democracy. And in vivo, I did that where you can make searches on, you know, how often do they use these indicators of social and Green Europe in the same context as justice and democracy. I did it within 5 words, right? So with 5 words distance, in order to say they are also appealing to emotions. So what this one means, for instance, here is that the red one, social Europe, the social platform, is that 50% of the times when there is a reference to social Europe, it will also happen in the context of justice and democracy being used, the words. It's hard to, because I don't really, these can be compared with each other, I guess, you know, but otherwise I don't have much to compare with. But my assessment was that I think it's quite often that you see that their key area of operation, social Europe or Green Europe, is also taking place within the context of them talking about justice and democracy. So an indicator of emotions. And no, this is the kind of stuff that I rarely do. Before someone else tell me, I wasn't sure about this at all. But I could see some patterns, right? And I sent it off, and it was accepted in a very good journal very quickly. You know, the best review I've ever had. You know, in a few weeks, it was true in that journal. So someone else as well. It's just to say that, but these are non-standard methods where I argue for the different choices and so on that I make in order to try to study emotions. Yeah.
Can I just ask back to the graph?
Yeah.
About the occurrences of democracy and justice.
Yeah.
Was that deductively or inductively determined?
I mean, it was both. I started out by making all sorts of searches, you know, and thinking about how can I at all try to, by using this software and content analysis, try to attach these discourses also to emotions. And I should say it's also a particular format, these documents. You know, it's not super emotional kind of literature, these annual reports, right? So they're not talking about love and hate and that kind of thing. So you have to think about words which are used and that can perhaps illustrate that something extraordinary is at play. So and I can't remember what exactly I think actually I used some of the sort of the words associated with feelings, and there wasn't much. And then I went to the literature and dug into that again, and I got from Edelman, I think it's called, from the 70s, who talks about political language and the effects of that and so on, and came up with democracy and justice. And I thought, and also, I mean, I was about to say intuitively, but obviously it's not just intuitively, but I thought it sounded like that could be illustrative of maybe not language which are sort of indicating emotions in texts which are not super emotional. I would also say this is not how I would do it today. I would actually do it differently. How I would look into, and this is something I'm working on currently, the use of metaphors, for instance, analogies and so on, which are more which are not, words that you count, but you can still code it a metaphor and analogy and so on, which are often associated with something. And the metaphor in the European context can be when the President of the European Commission will say, and this is what I'm focusing on in its ongoing work, during the early days of the COVID-19 at press conferences, von der Leyen would refer to that we do this because we need to show solidarity, and this is the Europe that the founding fathers of Europe was hoping for us to have, right? So this is a way sort of to make a reference to another time period and sort of invoke feelings at least. So I'm operating with 6 different categories, like metaphors, analogies, and intertextual reference and so on. That would be another time.
Can I ask you, I sort of struggle, I mean, I fully understand why you chose this approach, and apparently it worked, and it seems logical, but I still struggle with the emotion in that.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you substitute the word emotion with salience, it could also be that, justice and democracy are just signifiers for
Importance, yeah.
Like, watch out, there comes something important. So, to what extent is it really the emotion, or just, sort of like a highlighter?
Yeah.
This is the important bit of the text that you should pay attention to.
Yeah. Well, it could be, yeah. It could also be example of salience. I think the best defense of myself I can do here is to say that that the transparency in this work allow you to make that critique. And I think that's important also in discourse analysis. Discourses are, to me, also empirical. We need to be transparent in the way that we try to capture them. And transparency also means we open up for critiques. Right? But that's a good academic thing, rather than saying, well, then there was this discourse, and that's the, I mean, sometimes you will see literature where discourse is treated like something that you just pick in from one side to explain the stuff you can't explain otherwise, without actually identifying what is the discourse about. So that's one thing. I'm not sure whether, well, it could be an example of salience. Yeah, I guess it could. And salience could also be an example of that this is really important to us and we associate it with, with feelings. But I don't know, it's a measure thing. But, one thing I thought, and I think this was because when I do this kind of thing, I tend to think that I need to convince myself that I got something, a pattern or something before I'll be able to convince someone else. So, what kind of convinced me that is that it was perhaps a kind of a pattern here, is that I think it was it took that actually where are they? It took they refer more often when we just take the simple word count more often to unsustainable and sustainable than they do inclusive and exclusive. And you should probably expect that they would be more concerned about perhaps inclusion on labor market and so on. But when you count just the words, not. But when we look into social Europe, then there will actually be that's what they attach with feelings, not the sustainability part, which I also searched, and in the text in the article I also mentioned that that they were not as often, even if they used the term more often, it was rarely associated with democracy and legitimacy. So I thought that was quite interesting, right? Any other questions? I know I've been talking a lot. I hope I haven't been too much all over the place. But it's, the research process, the extent to which I have, it would also be kind of reflecting a research process.